Hello, this is a video made for Systematic Theology for the introductory course, the introductory session. So this is introducing you to Systematic Theology. I'll give you a little bit of a brief introduction to a couple of the folks that we're going to be reading. So I'm going to share screen. Feel free to watch this. You can rewatch it. You can pause it and watch it again if you'd like. Okay. So this is Systematic Theology, an introduction. First, I'm going to go over a little bit of introduction, then I'll go briefly over some points that Tillich makes, and then I'll introduce you to Williamson, Clark Williamson, who studied with Tillich, and then also introduce you to Monica Coleman, who studied with Marjorie Suhaki, another author that we're going to be reading. First question is, what is theology? So I encourage you to reflect upon that. Most of you have taken an introduction to theology already. If you haven't, I encourage you to read Duke and Stone's book on thinking theologically, and any other sort of introduction to theology that you might find. And if you have questions about that, I'm happy to give you some suggestions. Some folks might say that theology is about thinking about God, but how can we think about God? Like, because God is not like right there, right? So really we have to think about how we understand who God is, and that's related to our faith. So really it's how do we think about God's relation as God relates to humans. A famous definition of theology is faith-seeking understanding. I encourage you to reflect upon the difference between the way that many disciplines approach understanding and study, because most disciplines approach things by looking at the data first and then coming up with an understanding about it and then having faith about it. This is actually, Anselm is saying, one steps into the dialectic or the merry-go-round, as one of my professors used to say, of theology, steps into it as saying, I have faith, I want to understand more. I believe in God, I have an engagement with God, I have a relationship with that which is divine, but I seek to understand more, rather than standing back and saying, well, let me explore it and figure out whether or not I want to believe or not. Part of that is a function of the way that belief functions, what belief is, what faith is. Belief may be something that you can, those of you who've taken intro to theology, remember with Tillich's discussion about the difference between belief and faith, that belief is more of a cognitive claim, whereas faith is something of the whole person, a whole person's engagement with that which is ultimate to them, with that which is divine, with that which is transcendent beyond what they can see and know with facts. Faith seeking understanding. So it's someone who has this experience, this engagement with that which is divine, seeking to learn more and understand more. The work of theology, then, is to interpret this Christian faith in relation to the context in which we live, and to interpret that context in light of the Christian faith, so that we might understand how to live in the world. Now, this is a quote from Clark Williamson, who we're going to study more in a moment. I encourage you to reflect upon that, how important it is to, the point of theology is to figure out how to best to live in the world with ourselves, with God, with each other. Theology is also understood as reasoned reflection upon that which is ultimate in power and relation. So that which is ultimate in the universe and beyond the universe, really, and in ultimate in its relationship, it's relating to others in each entity, including ourselves. And every dimension of ourselves, both present, that which is conscious and unconscious, and also that which is past and future. Theology is also about reflection upon meaning, and how God and our understanding of God is meaningful for us and for the rest of the world. Clark also talks about theology in these simple terms, which are, they're not simplistic, but they're simple and direct. Theology addresses the answers to these basic questions. Who is God? Who are we? And what are we to do? So we will continue to reflect upon who is God, who are we, and what we are to do, and that will structure this course. So I encourage you to reflect upon your answers to those questions. Those who you have taken Intro to Theology previously with me probably have written paper on this, at least one, if not two, and engaged with these questions. So I encourage you to reflect more deeply about that as we continue to go forward. In this course, we will be examining theological reflections, experiences, and systems of thinking about God in the world, about humanity, about sin and redemption, and sanctification. Think of redemption and sanctification as two elements of salvation. We'll also be thinking about the church and its practices. What do we mean by the church? Who is the church? What makes up the church? Who makes up the church? Is salvation in the church, beyond the church? And what are the practices of the church? What are our liturgy? What does baptism mean? What does Eucharist mean? What does communion mean? What does ordination mean? And also then the last moments or last things is the kingdom of God, whether that's something that is incarnate in the world right now, that we're working to incarnate in the world or bring into the world, or whether it's something that we're looking forward to in the future, like eschatology. You are asked, by the way, before we get into that, you as the students you're going to be asked to read and digest various perspectives, and unpack your own embedded assumptions, your own embedded theologies, reflect upon them, and reflect upon your deliberative theologies as well, and critically integrate those deliberative claims that you've made as you construct a system of theology. And this system and this deliberative reflection, as you continue to kind of move back and forth between that which is embedded and that which is deliberative, and figuring out how you want to put those elements of theology together, because theology is systemic, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And it's a system, right? So it's all interrelated. So what you think about one element is related to what you think about another element. And you want to bring those together into your own constructive theology. And this will grow and change throughout the course, but it'll grow and change throughout your ministry and your life. And if it doesn't, you need to come back to seminary and get some more inspiration. So we're going to begin with Tillich. And Tillich was one of the most extraordinary theologians of the 20th century, if not the most extraordinary. He understands the function, he understands theology as a function of the church, and it stands within its witness. Right? Theology is within the witness of the church. It's not the only witness of the church, but it is the intellectual reflection and critical evaluation of what the church stands for and says and does. Tillich begins his Systematic Theology, Volume 1, with this: theology, as a function of the church, of the Christian church, must serve the needs of that church. So think about this. Theology, the work that we're doing here, while sometimes it seems a little heady, it's always about being a function of the church, of this Christian church. Even if we are thinking about understanding God beyond Christian conceptions of God and beyond Christian the context of Christianity, but thinking about God, who is beyond our Christian understanding of who God is. It's almost like our Christian understanding of who God is are the lens through which we as Christians perceive God and then act and understand who we are, but also then act in an informed way to bring this kingdom into the world, to bring this community of love and justice into the world. Tillich employs a method of correlation, and this method of correlation is an amazing method. It's the one that I like and I use typically, and that is this dynamic process, and it's done anew and over and over again. It's of correlating, bringing together the temporal situation with the eternal message. So, by the way, the situation, the temporal situation is something broader than the situation in one particular or limited community or a particular person. Rather, it refers to, as Tillich says, the scientific and artistic, political, economic, and ethical forms in which people interpret their lives. Now, he's careful to remind us this is not to be confused with the psychological state in which an individual is living, nor can it be limited to one individual or a particular group in fashioning your theology, because theology in God is for the whole universe, particularly for us, for the earth, particularly for us, for our community, for the people around us, but also with implications for how God engages with the whole world, not just us and our community and our needs. It must be broader than my own psychological or the sociological construct or an issue, a particular issue that's engaging us at the moment, which has a limited scope. And hopefully we will go further as we address some of the contextual issues that we're dealing with. We go further and broader. Theology is meant to be universally, not just cultural or limited to a particular group, right? It's the whole world in the moment. God is engaging with the whole world at the same time, simultaneously. The existential situation, the existential situation, he says, is the creative interpretation of existence, the totality of humankind's self-interpretation. So let's reflect upon that. It seems a little heady, but reflect upon what that could be. I invite you to reflect upon that, the totality of humankind's self-interpretation. What does it mean to be human? And as I mentioned before, I said I was going to get back to systematic versus systemic. And the systematic is not merely a structure of, we're going to talk about this point, and then we're going to talk about that point, and then we're going to talk about this other point. It's not simply making an outline of what you're going to say, although it might look like there's a lot of outline, there's a lot of organization to this course. And often systematic theology is organized and structured in the same way, where you talk about method, you talk about who is God, you talk about creation and what it means to be human and how we got where we are, often talking about sin, and then what do we do about sin, salvation, redemption, sanctification. After we've addressed the problems of sin, how do we become better people? Then how do we relate to each other in communities? And how do we make the world a better place as we're engaging in these communities, and those communities become broader and we relate communities to communities? And then what's the end goal? All of that sounds like it's a system. It is, and that's what I mean. It's not It's not simply an outline, it's a whole system. So what one has to say about who people are and what the problem is with people. Like, why are we not able to be who we fully are called to be? Whether we call that sin or we call that personal sin or structural sin, has to be related to what Jesus enables us to do, how Jesus enables the world, us included, the community, to be transformed, to gain freedom, to be saved, and to participate in our own, working out our own salvation, our own sanctification. Theology is more like a circular and spiral system, not like a straight line, but everything is related to everything else. So what one thinks about one element is going to affect what one thinks about another element. So the answers that you've given that maybe have been reflected upon deliberatively about who people are and what we're called to do are going to impact how we understand how we fail and what causes us to fail. If you keep your embedded assumptions about sin, it's going to be hard to engage your deliberative understandings of who Jesus is and how Jesus enables us to let go of some of that and work through and be saved, and work through our own salvation and sanctification with the presence of the Holy Spirit in the midst of the church and community in the world. So I hope that makes sense. Oops, I don't know why it goes backwards. Okay, so there's sources of theology, which we've talked a little bit about last time, and there is an assignment for each of you to take a look at some of the sources, and these are the general sources of theology, particularly as Tillich understands them, but a little more broadly, perhaps. But we will address it a little more broadly later in the sources that I'm asking you to reflect upon, which we'll share in class time next week or the week after, depending on what the syllabus says. So first of all, the sources and medium of theology includes the Bible. For many, the Bible is unquestionably a source of theology. Perhaps, like for John Wesley, it's the main source of theology. But how do we interpret the Bible? How do we understand what the Bible says? Because when it was written, it was written by a variety of different people from a variety of different contexts and perspectives, anywhere from 5,000, 4,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago. And things change. Words mean something different, particularly in a different language, in a language that's not spoken these days, particularly the ancient Hebrew. We'll explore a little bit about the complexity of reading and interpreting what a Hebrew term might mean, since Hebrew doesn't have vowels, doesn't have pointing, they call it, and it also doesn't have punctuation. So you're never quite sure where the end of the sentence is. And there are a lot of examples of putting the punctuation in a different place can change the meaning of the sentence or phrase, certainly a paragraph. So we'll also take a look at historical tradition, because that helps us interpret the Bible. It also helps us understand how people have not just interpreted the Bible, but how they've applied and engaged the Bible, how they've read the Bible and lived the Bible in different time periods and in different contexts, and the different issues that have come up and how those have been dealt with and engaged. For example, the notion of sin very much is our current understanding of sin, our current theological engagements with sin, are very much related to what Augustine and Aquinas have to say about human nature and how God is related to human nature, and whether or not human nature is free, and how we can bring Christ into our lives and how that can help break the power of sin. None of this is very clearly delineated in the Bible, right? There's a little, Paul talks a little bit about it here and a little bit about it there. And sometimes how Paul's metaphors for talking about sin are very different from one letter to the other. Running a race and not getting quite there is very different than being incapacitated to make any right decision without Christ, which is the way that Calvin and Luther might understand it. Anyway, so we'll talk some more about that. Then Tillich also highlights the history of world religion and culture as a source of theology, because God is not, for Tillich, and I believe he is correct, that God is not limited to engaging with people who wrote the Christian and Jewish Bibles, but rather God engages the whole world. So the history of world religion and culture is a very important source as well. God engages persons in different religions, in different cultures, in different histories, in different times, in different ways, because they have different needs and different questions. So Tillich looks at the history of world religion and culture, and Williamson agrees with this engagement with the source as a source of religion. And then reason. And reason is not merely just the logic and how we put things together and making things be consistent and coherent. It includes those things, how we make arguments. So if you haven't looked at how we make our arguments and how to think critically about making arguments, I encourage you to take a look at the text that's in the Bible. I mean, in the Systematic Theology Bible, the syllabus about making arguments. I think there's a couple books mentioned there. But reason is also about what human reason has discerned about ourselves. So that would be the insights of psychology and sociology, but also the insights about the world. So physics, biology. So these are important elements of reason, and human knowledge as well are important sources of us creating this, constructing a theology that enables us a system that makes sense out of who God is, who we are, and what we are to do. And then Tillich reminds us that all of these are mediated through experience. Each of them has an element of experience. It is the interpretive framework through which all sources are grasped and integrated. Experiences can be immediate experience of oh, I had an insight, or I had an encounter with that which is divine, whether in church or in the mountains, or with the birds, or with a special person, maybe in a counseling situation, or sometimes, I mean, I've had an encounter with a complete stranger that I'm sure was the presence of my passed away father, that, after 5 minutes or 10 minutes, when I looked again, it was like, that's not him. But it was him in the moment. Anyway, experience can also be something that is known over time. In my experience, an experience of a lifetime, I have found that doing this kind of practice enables me to uncover some of my biases, my cultural biases. And I have learned over time in the experience that when I do this has happened. Or when such and such a thing occurs in the world or in church, it indicates healing is happening, for example. Now moving into Clark Williamson. Clark Williamson, who passed away recently, used to teach here at the seminary, and we're going to be reading his book, and this is going to be one of the main texts that we're going to be reading, his Way of Blessing, Way of Life. And this is a general introduction. And here's a little picture of him at one of the lunches that I had with him. Here's his dates. You see that he's a Scorpio. He was a Scorpio, and he was beloved. He was a little codger at times. He was a beloved professor at CTS, and for 40 years or almost 40 years, He was deeply involved at Central Christian Church, which is just down the street from where I live here, on New Jersey. No, not New Jersey. I can't remember the name of the street, but it's just down there. He wrote for the church, definitely for the church. So he's not just writing for philosophers or even for the general public. He's writing for persons that are in the church. He's writing for its people. So several of his books are focused on rooting out and healing the anti-Judaism that is assumed in much Christian thought. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And again, he wrote for clergy and for laity. Following the work of theology, he says, following Tillich's lead, with, for him, a very practical bent, is to interpret the Christian faith in relation to the context in which we live. Think about that. We're interpreting the Christian faith in relation to the context in which you are living, and to interpret that context in light of the Christian faith. So it's this back and forth, this dialectic that I talked about in terms of this method of theology, which is this kind of walk of faith. This it's a little bit like juggling, I suggest, moving up and down, like one side, the other side. You have to kind of, it's dynamic, so you have to keep it going. So it is to interpret the Christian faith in relation to the context in which we live, and to interpret the context of that context in light of the Christian faith, so that we might understand how better to live in the world. It is written for seminary students at Christian Theological Seminary, just like yourselves, and for church folk. His hope is to help us think critically, clearly, and conversationally. He thinks of theology as a conversation. He lists several conversation partners who have influenced his theological reflection and formations over the years. It's a genuine conversation between the Christian message and the communities in which we live. So his conversational partners include process theology and thinkers, and they focus on relationality, creativity, experience, and process. Paul Tillich, he gets the method of correlation of message with the existential situations and questions. Post-Shoah theology. God's covenant is with Israel, and it is expanded to Christians. It's not superseded by Jesus. And he will encourage us and help us to continue our critical reading of the tradition with this in mind, to make sure that we don't continue this unfortunate tradition of hatred that has led to not just the Holocaust, but continues to lead to anti-Jewish violence and beliefs and hatred. Clark is also influenced, so he's influenced by process, Tillich, very much a post-Shoah theologian. He's also interested in narrative theology, and by which he means he attends to the way that God and Jesus play roles in the paradigmatic stories in the Bible, and thinking about how we engage with those stories in the Bible, and where Jesus is in the stories that we tell, where God is in the stories that we tell, and how we can better engage in those stories. He also is influenced very much by feminist theology to redress the anti-women elements in the tradition, the Christian tradition, using Rosemary Radford's feminist critical principle of promoting the full humanity of women. And I encourage you to reflect upon who your conversation partners are. Now, we're also going to be reading Monica Coleman, and she talks about making a way out of no way. That's her book, A Postmodern Womanist Theology. Her book is a womanist theology and a postmodern womanist theology. The womanist theology is a response to sexism in Black theology and racism in feminist theology. It examines the social construction of Black womanhood in relation to African American religious concepts. So she's going to explore the way that womanhood has been understood in relation to African American religion in general, as not just Christianity, but more broadly understood. She takes seriously Black women's experience as persons who are created in the image of God. And this has been a not controversial, but not always attended to. She affirms the positive elements of the church and also critiques the negative ones. Womanist analysis of religion and culture also attends to the triple oppression of racism, sexism, and classism. Since Black women's experiences are the foundation for womanist theology, she seeks to unearth the hidden African American women's experiences for the resources to do theology. So you'll see her doing that throughout the text. And she's also influenced very much by postmodern process theology. There's no one universal way of understanding God, humanity, and the world. And this is postmodern and process theology that we already mentioned earlier. For process theology, there are multiple ways and multiple voices that are needed. God offers possibilities to the world and to each of us in the world in multiple ways and multiple forms, and urging us to choose the paths that lead to a vision for the common good. This is process theology. God's values and vision don't change, but the way it is played out depends upon the situation and the orientation of the world and its inhabitants in any given moment. So there's the dynamic element of process theology, but there's the also grounded foundational elements of process theology in terms of who God is and what God's values are. The world is interdependent upon God. So God and the world are interrelated, interdependent, and both evil and good play out in the larger context than just the immediate. So what happens in the immediate affects people and entities and other factors throughout. It kind of like throw a pebble into a pond or a small lake, and those ripples move outward, continuing to affect. And any moment is also impacted and affected by things that have happened in the past. So what Monica Coleman does is she brings together womanist theology and process theology to make a way out of no way in various situations and contexts. For God is within and among each of us in the church and beyond. She brings these two together in various situations and contexts. Her theology names God as that power of creativity, novelty, and beauty that is within and among each of us in the church and beyond, seeking justice for the oppressed and luring all toward greater creative transformation. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in class.